Section 3 of Imperialism and World Politics, Part 2 of 4, by Parker Thomas Moon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Alistair. Chapter 9a, The Legacy of Cecil Rhodes. For those who believe with Carlyle that great events are shaped by heroes, the history of empire building is replete with apparent proofs, and no better illustration of the theory can be found than the story of British imperialism in South Africa. So easily may the development of British South Africa be regarded as simply the expansion of the career of Cecil Rhodes, that for the purposes of our narrative his life may well be followed as the central thread of the tale. And yet, as it will be pointed out on occasion, the exploits of the hero were more closely related to geographical, political, and economic conditions, and therefore more essentially similar to the work of other empire builders than an uncritical admirer would suspect. Subsection: Diamonds and Gold. On September the 1st, in the year of the Franco-Prussian War, a tall, lanky, rather pale young man, hardly more than a boy, stepped from the gangplank of his steamer to the dock at Durban on the coast of Natal, South Africa. Doubtless he wondered, as he looked about him in this unfamiliar town, what future this new land of opportunity held in store for him, for, like many another such immigrant, he was a younger son of a respectable but impecunious family. His father, a devout Anglican pastor, had sent 4 sons into the army, 3 to the colonies, to make careers for themselves, and had intended this youngest son for the church or the law. But the boy's health failed, and fearing that he would fall victim to tuberculosis, his father felt that the bracing, dry climate of South Africa would benefit the lad. Years after, when the boy had become the great man of South Africa, he explained,
"They will tell you that I came out on account of my health, or for love of adventure, and to some extent that may be true, but the real fact is that I could no longer stand the eternal cold mutton."
The South Africa to which Cecil Rhodes came in 1870 was an interesting study in black and white. More than 2 centuries ago, the first white settlers had arrived in Table Bay to found a Dutch naval station at the place now known as Cape Town in 1652. Slowly the naval station, intended at first merely to supply Dutch fleets en route to and from the distant Dutch East Indies, had grown into a Dutch colony of farmers or Boers, meaning farmers, employing Negro slaves from West Africa to till their fields and watch their herds. French Huguenots fleeing the wrath of Louis XIV had found refuge in Cape Colony in 1690, and mingled their blood with that of the Dutch. But during the Napoleonic Wars an English fleet had appeared in the bay to take possession of the colony, 1806, and the British conquest, ratified by diplomacy in 1814, established the cornerstone of British rule in South Africa. At that time there were in Cape Colony about 26,000 Boers of Dutch and French extraction, with 29,000 Negro slaves, 17,000 Hottentots, and a dwindling remnant of the race of Bushmen. The last named were tawny-coloured savages, diminutive in stature but untamable in disposition, who had been hunted by white settlers and driven into the deserts north of the colony. The Hottentots, or Tots, a copper-coloured, woolly-haired race of herdsmen, described by one traveller as
"without doubt both in body and in mind, the laziest people under the sun,"
had proved less irreconcilable. Many had become slaves and servants to the Boers, while others retired to the inland deserts and prairies. Many, too, had been swept off by smallpox and other diseases brought in by the whites. Many of their women, serving the pleasure of Dutch settlers, had given birth to a race of half-breeds called Griekers, or bastards, who were led by a missionary in 1803 to settle in the region now called Griekenland, on the eastern outskirts of Cape Colony. East and north of the colony were strong tribes of warlike Negroes, the Basutos, the Zulus, the Kafirs, and the Bechuanas, all belonging to the Bantu division of the Negro race. Their fierce opposition was a grave obstacle to the settlement of white pioneers in the healthful upland prairies, the grass-covered veldt, northeast of the colony, or along the eastern coast where the rainfall was more abundant than in the west. For example, when 5,000 British settlers were brought into South Africa in 1820 through 1821 and attempted to colonise the eastern border of the colony, they lived in terror of the Kaffirs, and a long succession of Kaffir wars had to be fought before the pioneers could breathe freely. Nevertheless, hardy pioneers did push out into the back country, particularly after the abolition of slavery, with inadequate compensation, by the English authorities caused several hundred Dutch farmers to trek out of the colony in search of new homes in 1836. These trekkers had established themselves on the grass-covered plateau, or high veldt, and in the eastern coastland. The coastland settlement became the colony of Natal, and was annexed by Great Britain in 1843, but on the veldt arose the Boer republics of Transvaal and Orange Free State, both recognised as independent in the 1850s. When Cecil Rhodes arrived on the scene, then, the coastlands of Cape Colony and Natal were British colonies, with about 200,000 white colonists, mostly Boers, with several times as many slaves and natives. The Orange River bounded British claims. To the northeast on the high veldt were the sparsely settled independent Boer republics, and to the north and northwest were vast expanses of dry plateau lands, partly desert, partly covered with tufts of grass and stunted shrubs, thinly peopled by Negroes, Bushmen and Hottentots, unclaimed by any European power. Rhodes arrived at an opportune moment, when British imperialism was beginning to revive, and when South Africa in particular was on the eve of a marvellous expansion. He came just after a Dutch farmer had found his children playing marbles with a diamond worth $2,500, just after glittering wealth was discovered at Kimberley and other places on the northern frontier, in the land of the Griekers. The rush of diamond diggers to Griekenland had begun, and Griekenland was about to be annexed by Britain in 1871. Among the prospectors was Cecil's brother, and him Cecil followed in October 1871. With cumbrous ox cart and provisions, the youth set out on his long and leisurely journey, equipped with a few volumes of classical literature to while away the time. It was an inspiring experience. The clear, bracing air and the endless grassy expanse of the high veldt awakened the young man's vision. Here was God's country, a country made for the white man and for Britain. Later on, he was to attempt its conquest, but for the present his energy was bent to the making of a fortune. Rhodes made his millions not by picking diamonds out of the gravel, but by business combinations. Trust building, Americans would say. Soon after reaching the diamond fields, he entered into partnership with C.D. Rudd. When other miners became discouraged, or found their capital exhausted, Rhodes and Rudd purchased their claims or took them into partnership. Within 16 years, Rhodes found himself master of the De Beers Mining Company, paying 25% dividends on a capital of over $10 million, and possessing a virtual monopoly of one of the two chief diamond fields. But he had a rival, Barnett Isaacs, who had come to Africa, so it is said, with 60 boxes of cigars as capital, changed his name to Bani Banato, made money as a middleman between diamond miners and diamond exporters, purchased claims, and established the Central Company, which held the same dominant position in the rich Kimberley mines that the Rhodes Company enjoyed in the De Beers field. Between Rhodes and Banato, competition became so keen that both did some serious thinking. Figuring it out that the public would spend no more for diamonds than 4 million sterlings a year, Rhodes concluded that the producer's interest was to restrict the output and thus maintain high prices. To this end, Banato was willing to enter a price agreement, but Rhodes was bent on amalgamation. His dealings in this crisis afford an interesting instance of the financial internationalism of nationalistic imperialism. By borrowing money from the Rothschilds of London and selling a block of De Beers shares through a German syndicate, he obtained funds to buy out a fairly large French company's holdings in Kimberley. These he sold to Banato for a minority interest in Banato's company. Then raising funds with the aid of Alfred Beert, a prosperous German who had come to South Africa from Hamburg and later became a staunch British imperialist, Rhodes began to buy up other minority interests in Bonato's company until Bonato admitted defeat and accepted amalgamation in 1888. Smaller independents were now easily swallowed up in the growing trust, and by 1890 De Beers consolidated mines, of which Rhodes, Bonato, Beert and Stowe were life governors, had a monopoly of South African diamonds, 90% of the world's supply. Meanwhile, Rhodes had begun a similar process of trust building in the gold mines, which had been discovered in the Witwatersrand, in Transvaal in 1886. He had established a company, the Goldfields of South Africa Limited, with a modest capital of £125,000 sterling to buy up prospectors' claims. The company grew rapidly, changing its name to Consolidated Goldfields of South Africa as it approached a monopoly position. 50% dividends were not unusual, nor was it exceptional for Rhodes to derive from $1 to $2 million a year in profit from this concern. His combined diamond and gold interests, together with innumerable smaller enterprises, must have yielded him an income of about $5 million a year in the 1890s, when he was at the height of his career. Subsection: Rhodes the Empire Builder. Not, however, as the ruthless business monopolist and manipulator, but as the patriotic imperialist, or as the founder of the Rhodes Scholarships, is this South African diamond and gold king usually remembered. He used his immense wealth to promote British imperialism, and imperialism, reciprocally, to promote his wealth. His imperialism was undoubtedly sincere and extraordinarily philosophical. One biographer tells of the mental struggles through which Rhodes passed as a young man in his search for an explanation of the universe and a view of life. "There must be a God," he said to himself, "and if there be a God, there must be a divine purpose in history." The purpose, it appeared, was the evolution of humanity toward a finer type. Now, it is obvious to any Englishman that the breed of men best suited for survival in such an evolution is the so-called Anglo-Saxon race. The conclusion easily follows that to serve the divine purpose, one should strive to promote the predominance of the Anglo-Saxon race, and since the surface of the earth is limited, as Rhodes himself said, a vigorous effort should be made to obtain as much land as possible, while land is to be had, for the future expansion of this race. To be more specific, let us examine the terms of the will made by Rhodes in 1877, when he was still but a young man. He planned at that time to leave his property to endow a secret society whose aim would be to extend British colonisation and British rule throughout the world. All Africa was to be a British colony, and all South America, the Monroe Doctrine being surmounted by the simple device of reincorporating the United States into the British Empire, and in addition Oceania, the Malay Peninsula, the seaboard of China and India, Mesopotamia, Palestine, and various other smaller morsels. While others thought in provinces, said Rhodes, I think in continents. Here was a grandiose vision, worthy of a pan-German. But Rhodes did not intend despotic empire. The British colonies were to be self-governing, and the British flag was to mean defence, not domination. To bind the dominions together, there would be colonial representation in the Imperial Parliament, and colonial subsidies would be given to the Imperial Navy, but above all, a system of preferential tariffs would be established for the future government of the world is a question of tariffs. For all his altruistic philosophy of imperialism, the great imperialist was also a businessman, not at all insensible to the importance of economic motives in politics. Perhaps no better summary of his attitude could be given than his own. Pure philanthropy is very well in its way, but philanthropy plus 5% is a good deal better. 50% he might have said, and he used the philanthropy plus method not only for himself, but in dealing with those who were necessary tools in the realisation of his dream of empire. He gave business tips to obliging politicians and opportunities to political lieutenants. He contributed to the campaign funds of the British Liberals on condition that they should not
scuttle out of Egypt.
Footnote. See Campbell Bannerman's indignant denial with a summary of the later proof of the contribution. In J. A. Spender, Life of Campbell Bannerman, Volume 1, pages 202 through 7. End of footnote. He purchased newspapers to plead his cause. He knew the power of money. Just a thumbnail sketch of the old man, as his protégés called him, may lend more reality and perhaps more significance to the political narrative that follows. A tall man he was, with piercing steel blue eyes, looking out from under a crop of curly grey hair. His careless dress and many eccentricities, such as taking a cow, some hens, and his own brands of champagne and Cumel with him on sea voyages, were amusing earmarks of a self-made man too arrogant for acceptance of ordinary restrictions. If he took champagne and stout mixed in the morning, champagne by the tumbler at dinner, and stronger potations through the evening, he was by no means excessive, but merely a heavy and methodical drinker. That he enjoyed being told he resembled the Emperor Hadrian, that like Napoleon he tweaked the ears of subordinates, that toward opposition he showed the intolerance of a self-confessed creative genius, indicated something of his magnificent egotism. But the fact that he succeeded so greatly must be ascribed to other and more admirable characteristics: indomitable grit, mastery of details, unflinching perseverance when weaker men would falter. If he thought in continents, Rhodes nevertheless had to deal, like other men, in provinces, for only by fractions are continents won. The immediate task he set for himself was to extend British rule northward from Cape Colony, across the Boer republics of the Orange River and Transvaal, and on to the lake region of East Central Africa.
All this painted red,
he would say, as he passed his hand over this part of the map. And this South African empire of the future, he dreamed, would one day be connected with Egypt by a Cape to Cairo railway. The first step was to acquire the wide expanse of arid deserts and grasslands known as Bechuanaland, directly north of Cape Colony. As this region lay like a corridor between the Boer republics of Orange River and Transvaal on the east, and German Southwest Africa on the west, it was aptly described by Rhodes as the Suez Canal of South Africa. It was the vital gateway to the north. Without it, British South Africa might be hemmed in on the north by a sea-to-sea band of Boer and German territory. It may be remarked, by the way, that German imperialists were eager to win the friendship of the Boers, as distant linguistic kinsmen, and some even hoped that the Boers might accept German protection. To gain Bechuanaland, Rhodes first exerted himself. Having entered politics in Cape Colony and made himself a power at Cape Town, Rhodes began a vigorous agitation for British acquisition of Bechuanaland. He himself made a visit to the region in 1884, but failed to achieve his aim because of the opposition of the Transvaal Boers, who were at this time extending their influence into the region. However, the propaganda conducted by Rhodes, reinforcing the pressure of other imperialists, led the British government in 1885 to send an army into Bechuanaland, and on September the 30th, a British protectorate was proclaimed, extending as far west as the border of German Southwest Africa and as far north as the parallel of 22 degrees south. The road to the north was now secure. It must now be used. North of Bechuanaland and Transvaal was a great tableland, fertile and well-watered, within the tropics to be sure, but high enough to be eminently suitable for white colonization. Its southern part was inhabited by Negro tribes, the Matabeles and Mashonas, under the rule of an able and warlike chieftain, King Lo Bengula. There was imminent danger that this desirable land would fall into other hands. Portuguese politicians were at this time exhibiting maps showing a broad band of Portuguese territory extending right across Mashonaland and Matabeleland, from Portuguese Mozambique to Portuguese Angola. The Transvaal Boers, too, having been foiled in Bechuanaland, were turning their attention toward Mashonaland. The British must act quickly, yet the officials were hesitant. It was Rhodes who acted. By offering to assume all the costs, he persuaded the British High Commissioner for South Africa, Sir Hercules Robinson, whose name did not indicate his character, to permit a British missionary to have a talk with King Lobengula. That dusky sovereign was induced to sign a treaty, pledging himself to refrain from negotiations with other foreigners without previous consent of the British High Commissioner for South Africa. This was necessary to forestall rivals. Then, with the Commissioner's consent, Rhodes sent 3 of his most trusted lieutenants to Lobengula's court. Theirs was a dangerous mission, for the caprice of the Negro king or the intrigues of rival Europeans might easily have brought about the murder of the small party. But at length Lobengula was induced to sign a most remarkable document, the celebrated mineral concession of October 30th, 1888, granting to Rudd, Maguire and Thompson, the delegates of Rhodes,
complete and exclusive charge over all metals and minerals situated and contained in my kingdom, principalities, and dominions,
together with the right
to exclude from my kingdoms, etc., all persons seeking land, metals, minerals, or mining rights therein.
Perhaps when it is explained that the region was supposed to be rich in gold, the plus which usually accompanied Rhodes's altruistic imperialism will here be patent without specific mention. The mess of pottage for which Lobengula sold his birthright consisted of 1,000 Martini rifles, 100,000 ball cartridges, and £100 sterling, payable
on the first day of every lunar month.
In addition, he had a strong desire for a steamboat, and to gratify it the negotiators threw into the bargain a second-hand steamer. How Lobengula himself understood this bargain may be learned from a plaintive message he later sent Queen Victoria.
Some time ago a party of men came into my country, the principal one appearing to be a man called Rudd. They asked me for a place to dig gold, and said they would give me certain things for the right to do so. I told them to bring what they would, and I would show them what I would give. A document was written and presented to me for signature. I asked what it contained, and was told that in it were my words, and the words of those men. I put my hand to it. About 3 months afterwards, I heard from other sources that I had given by that document the right to all the minerals of my country.
But Rhodes interpreted the concession as a permit to exploit and govern Lobengula's country, and following the example of other empire builders such as Goldie of West African fame and Mackinnon of East African celebrity, he organised a company, the British South Africa Company, and applied for a charter from the British government. The British Premier Lord Salisbury was at this time inclined to recognise Portugal's claims to the territory, but by much wire-pulling Rhodes won Salisbury over by inviting the Duke of Fife to become Vice-President and the Duke of Abercorn to become President of the projected company, and by stating his intention that
the conditions of the natives inhabiting the said territories will be materially improved and their civilization advanced.
Rhodes astutely enlisted both the prestige of the British aristocracy and the zeal of British humanitarianism to serve the ends of his business enterprise. The charter, signed by the Queen on October the 29th, 1889, gave the South Africa Company, for 25 years, the right to make treaties and laws, maintain police, construct roads, railways and harbours, develop mines and industries, make grants of land, and, in short, govern a vast but purposely undefined area, north of British Bechuanaland and Transvaal, and west of Portuguese Mozambique, but with no northern boundary. The latter was left unmentioned because Rhodes hoped to extend it far to the north. The business aspect of the venture was interesting. The chartered company had a capital of £1,001,000 shares. For themselves, the promoters took 90,000 shares, and 50% of any future profits. The De Beers Company bought 200,000. The other shares were sold, in large part, to small investors, whose loyalty to Rhodes and his project was a useful political asset. There was not much difficulty marketing the stock, thanks to the helpful advertising which Rhodes obtained from the press. The Times, for example, described the land as being
fabulously rich
in metals. The soil was
only in need of scratching to smile with corn,
and
cattle fatten in peace.
It was the storied
land of Ophir.
The glowing optimism of the press regarding the natural riches and salubrious climate of about-to-be-acquired colonies is a phenomenon which recurs in almost any country at almost every conquest, for some reason psychological or economic, which conventional historical research has failed to expose. Getting a concession from the Matabele king, who could not read, and actually occupying the king's territory to scratch the fertile soil and open the fabulous mines were quite dissimilar propositions, of which the latter was the more difficult. Rhodes himself grew anxious as he tried to make plans for the sending of settlers to make clearings in the forests and build their homes in the wilderness, with a fickle and savage chieftain at their back. But a young daredevil offered to lead the way, and a slender band of a few hundred pioneers was brought together by a promise of 15 gold claims and 3,000 acres of farmland for each man. They had to travel 460 miles on foot, making a road as they went, and often cutting a way through forests, before they reached the Promised Land. There, as Rhodes later admitted, they found that they could not pick up gold like gooseberries. Tropical rains fell upon their camp, enthusiasm gave way to dismal discouragement, and on the stock markets the shares of the company began to fall. Rhodes himself went out and restored confidence. Slowly the settlement grew, and its cattle began to fatten not in peace, as had been promised, but in constant danger of native raids, until at length the chartered company sent troops to conquer Lobengula and take his cattle. Like the man who admitted the camel's foot into his tent, Lobengula found himself driven out, though his sons were magnanimously educated at the expense of Rhodes. What had been Lobengula's kingdom became Rhodesia. About the international difficulties that attended the marking out of the chartered company's domain of Rhodesia, we need not enter into detail. To the north, Rhodesia was extended to meet Congo Free State and touch Lake Tanganyika, as Rhodes had hoped, but it was cut off from further extension by the Anglo-German Treaty of 1890, which brought German East Africa and the Free State together, leaving no land passage between. To the northeast there was some danger that Germany or Portugal might obtain a footing in the neighbourhood of Lake Nyassa. A British company, the African Lakes Company, however, cooperated with the London Missionary Society in opening up this region for Britain, and in 1893 a protectorate was proclaimed over the western shores of the lake, then styled British Central Africa, but later renamed Nyasaland. On the east of Rhodesia there were boundary disputes with Portugal, and on the west with Portugal and Germany, but these were cleared up by the Anglo-German agreements of 1890 and 1893, and the Anglo-Portuguese Treaty of 1891. Though Rhodes never lived to see Rhodesia become, as it is today, a link in a completed Cape to Cairo empire, the region his company acquired for Great Britain was by no means contemptible. 440,000 square miles of fertile land, suitable for white colonization and agricultural development. Only southern Rhodesia, a third of this great realm, has yet been colonized or developed to any considerable extent. Even here there were, when the 1921 census was taken, only 33,620 white settlers and 770,000 natives, less than 1 million all told, in a country 3 times as big as England. The best agricultural land was, of course, allotted to the whites, while large but poorer areas were set aside temporarily as reserves for the natives. Natives living on the reserves paid a head tax of £1 per annum, while those living on white men's land paid an additional £1 to the white owner. One of the purposes of these levies, it may be explained, was to provide the natives with an indirect incentive to work for the whites at wages that seem too incredibly small to mention. Intelligent and persistent efforts were made by the chartered company to promote farming and fruit growing in the hope of attracting English immigrants, but, as the above-mentioned figures indicate, southern Rhodesia has been less attractive than the United States to Englishmen seeking homes overseas, and desiring not to break ground in an almost uninhabited wilderness, but to find well-paid employment in a civilized and prosperous country. Gold mining, after all, has been the economic mainstay of the land. Though gold could not be picked up like gooseberries, it could be mined, and in the period from 1890 to 1921, the total amount of gold produced was no less than $250 million. Northern Rhodesia, still larger and still more sparsely populated than the southern province, had in 1921 about 1 million Negroes and 3,500 white men, scattered over high forested plateaus more extensive than England and France together. Here lead is mined instead of gold, and in the clearings cattle graze. For more than 30 years the chartered company governed Rhodesia pretty much as it pleased, though occasionally the London government intervened to prevent too ruthless treatment of the natives. As the white settlers grew more numerous in southern Rhodesia, however, and civilized towns sprang up here and there, the company found it necessary to give the whites representation in a legislative council. The demand for complete colonial self-government became increasingly strong, for the settlers were by no means agreeable to the chartered company's privileges, both political and economic. At length, in 1922, a vote was taken on the alternatives of joining the Union of South Africa or becoming a self-governing colony, and as the result favoured self-government, Southern Rhodesia was created a colony with government responsible to an elected assembly, and the political rule of the company in this part of its domain was ended. End of section 3.